Nora Krug is the author of Belonging, A German Reckons with History and Home, which was winner of the 2000. Now, I've seen 18 and 19.
I admit that I myself am confused about it. I think the prize was given in 19, but the book came out in 18, so I'm not sure.
I understand. Okay, great. Well, 2018 or 19 National Book Critic Circle Award, and named Best Book of 2018 by the New York Times. Her work has garnered medals from the Society of Illustrators and the New York Art Directors Club, and was chosen for Houghton Mifflin's Best American Series and the Sundance Film Festival. Krug received the Fulbright and Guggenheim Fellowships and was named Illustrator of the Year in 2019 by the Victoria and Albert Museum. She is an Associate Professor of Illustration at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, I mentioned just prior to turning the mic on that I first come across your work in Munich at the National Socialist Documentation Centre Museum. So I'm so happy to bring this into a discussion because it's been banging around in my head for about a year now. And one of the things that was most striking, incidentally, about On Tyranny, we're going to be talking about the illustrated graphic edition that you illustrated, was sort of running in parallel to the exhibition. Maybe you could tell me a bit about how that came about.
Yes, so the exhibition was held, as you said, in Munich, in this museum dedicated to studying the history of National Socialism, and it actually is placed in a very important, historically significant place, which was the Nazis' main administrative building, is set and still standing right next to the museum. And so that was obviously done on purpose in order to give it more context and avoid people from making pilgrimages to, this site, right-wing pilgrimages. And they approached me after my book Belonging came out, which is a memoir about my family history and the Second World War. And then also On Tyranny, the collaboration with Timothy Snyder started. And they are obviously a very political museum. And so they asked me and Timothy whether we wanted to coordinate the book launch. My publisher in Germany, C.H. Beck, is also located in Munich, whether we wanted to coordinate that book launch with an exhibition. And so we said yes, of course. And the exhibition is basically small stations, 20 stations that each represent one chapter in the book. And they're stationed were stationed throughout the main permanent exhibition. Yeah. So it's seen a little bit as a kind of not intervention, but kind of giving the historic permanent exhibition a different contemporary context.
Well, and also providing attendees with advice on how they can actually do something to help stop this happening again.
Yes, I mean, that's the whole point, I think, of Timothy's book On Tyranny and probably all of his other books. And I think that's also how our collaboration started, because in a way, that's our shared goal. I mean, he's doing it as a historian. I do it more as an illustrator who writes about personal, individual experience. But I think our shared goal is to make clear that history lives on within us and that we have a responsibility of remembering it and also making sure it doesn't repeat.
And you know what was so fascinating for me? I was, and it's funny, I say this, I was stopped in my tracks, which is a cliche, which is actually one of the lessons that you bring up, and that is to think for yourself and not use these kind of cliches. But I was certainly struck by one of the lessons because it talked about the importance of small talk as a kind of a glue for the community and for your society that held it together and encouraged democracy. And I was experiencing the opposite when I was in Germany. I was trying to reach out to various people, and I felt quite strongly that this wasn't happening. And so that really was it captured an experience that I was having.
Yes, I mean, I tried not to laugh when you were saying that. I didn't want to destroy the recording, but it is, I think, typical. I mean, in Germany, small talk is basically considered as
Yes.
a word. It's perceived as something superficial.
Yeah.
It basically means, why should we talk about the weather? Or, I mean, I know small talk can be about more than just the weather, but I think there's no appreciation for it. And I think there are probably many reasons. I mean, I think it was never part of our culture.
Well, it's not serious, right? It's sort of frivolous and a waste of time, I suppose.
Well, and also you don't know how to read it. Germans have a hard time reading the deeper meaning when some things aren't stated out in a very direct way. And I know Germans aren't the only culture where that's the case. I recently saw an interview with a Dutch woman who was talking about the same phenomenon there. So we very much rely on people saying what they think, which can sometimes lead to very awkward social situations. And I think there's also not always a merit in always saying what you think. And it's also not always necessary to always state your opinion. But I think what is maybe not really recognized there is the importance of small talk. And I agree with Timothy Snyder that it's really something that binds us together as a community. It makes us aware that we belong to a bigger whole, that we need each other, and that we have a responsibility for each other. And that's why he writes about it, because basically what happens if a society shifts towards tyranny or dictatorships is that if we don't feel that sense of responsibility for each other, certain groups can be excluded very quickly and marginalized, and that's the danger. And I think part of what's to blame here is a German experience of, I think Germans don't want to feel anymore like they belong to a bigger idea or ideology, because that's what we did under the Nazis. And I think Germany is a very individualized society. It's not just because of our history, but it's also because it's a very prosperous society. And it's also because it's a society where government takes care of you in terms of making sure that you have access to education, free education, healthcare. And I
so
think
you're not as reliant on the other, your neighbor, in other words?
Exactly. And I think, I mean, I'm all for that system. I feel like in America, we should be taken care of more by the government. But at the same time, it can discourage this sense of individualized responsibility for one another, volunteering for a cause. And I think that's where the small talk comes in as well. We just don't feel anymore that we need to have that sense of I mean, you have your friends in Germany, but I don't think there's as strong a sense of building a community and nurturing a community as you have here in the United States.
Yeah, that one little lesson in that exhibition sparked all sorts of conversations that I've had over the past year. And one of the things that I've talked about is I've done a lot of traveling over the last 10 years, visiting used bookstores and photographing and of course, buying stuff from them. In the States, we traveled all over the States. And, they talk about this great big divide, but almost universally, we've had just such I'm treated like the grandson of these, which is hard to believe, but of these lovely women at diners all across the country, everywhere, it seems. I've talked to Germans about this, and they say, oh, that's just superficial. How deep does that go? Do they want to talk any further about anything important? But still, it really, I think, spoke to me in a way that made me want to read the rest of the book.
Yeah, and I think, in America also, I don't think this society could exist, such a big country that's composed of people from all over the world that believe in different religions, that have different worldviews. In most countries like that, there would be civil wars happening over and over again. And I think the only reason for why it's working is because there is, of course, it's a utopia, but there is this shared idealism of, we have the same basic democratic values. And again, I know America is not always a democracy, but I think there's a belief in that idea, in that shared idea. And I think without that, America couldn't exist I mean, we are very divided, but in as peaceful a way as it is. And what I also liked about this lesson about small talk is that it really shows that resistance can take on so many forms, because when we think of the word resistance, we usually think about people who risk their lives. I mean, that's the ultimate idea of sacrifice, is if you sacrifice your own life for the greater good of your community or society. And that's an extremely, I mean, it's probably the bravest thing anybody can do. But this is not all that resistance is about, and it shouldn't end, I mean, it shouldn't begin there. I think there are so many other ways in which we can resist. And if we feel like we're not brave enough to resist in that way, there are many other ways we can resist in everyday situations. And I think we often neglect those things, and they actually make change. And, you know, when we think about the Nazi regime as well, people often here in the United States, in order to make me feel better, they often say, oh, I don't know what I would have done, because, you know, I would have probably not risked my life or the life of my family. But then we forget that there were things you could do, such as share food stamps with your Jewish neighbors, or warn your Jewish neighbors if you'd heard about things happening that would have not gotten you in trouble. And still many Germans decided not to do those things. And that's what I find so disturbing. And I think that's why it's so important to realize that we can do smaller things that help foster a sense of democracy and togetherness and support, a mutual support. And that's what I like about Timothy's book, is that both kinds of resistance are highlighted. And this is a special one because it seems so insignificant, but it's actually very important.
Yes. Well, speaking of the book itself, so again, I was prompted because of this experience with one of the lessons in that profoundly moving and disturbing museum. It's just a fascinating place. So I went after the book, and of course I found it, and it reminded me of the little Chairman Mao's little book, you know, in the sense that it's the same format, fits in your pocket, and it allows you to cart it around with you. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about your interpretation of his text. And one of the first observations I had was of the lines on the side of On Tyranny, the small book. And you've replicated those lines with crayon. In crayon, there's about 5 red lines on both sides of the covers. And it reminded me, it's kind of a column. This is a sturdy, well, perhaps you could tell me what you were trying to capture by replicating that.
Well, I mean, just talking about the initial non-illustrated edition again, I think it's beautifully formatted and designed. And I agree, it has this, I mean, of course, it's, it has this, it resonates with other books of rules, basically. I mean, I don't want to use the word ideology because that sounds dogmatic, but it is, you know, ideas that a democracy should believe in. And so it has this sort of official look to it, or pragmatic look to it too, but in a very elegant way. And the shape is also quite vertical, and it's made to look even more vertical. As we know, stripes going that way make things look thinner. So
yes,
they make the book look even more thin, and as you say, column-like. And then for my illustrated cover, and the book is obviously bigger in the illustrated edition because less text is on each page, but that was a pure marketing decision. Initially, I did not have these lines in my design, but then the marketing team, and I think it makes complete sense, suggested that we take some of the elements of the original cover so that the reader or the buyer makes a connection between the initial non-illustrated edition and this new one. But in the foreign edition, I happen to have the Dutch one here. We eliminated those lines because their original covers looked completely different from the American cover, so we didn't need those. But I think they add a nice sense of severity. I mean,
I think, and as I say, I'm put in mind of a column. Did you get any sense of that?
I didn't specifically think of that, but you know, these things probably always resonate in some way in one's head.
Yes.
I mean, for me, it's more like a severity, but in a way that you can hold on to, you know, something you can that can provide guidance. And I suppose that's maybe what goes through or went through architects' minds with the columns too. It has a certain presence. It says, it has a certain officialness, a certain, let's take this seriously. This is something we need to look at or think about or hold on to.
Yeah. Now, it seems to me it's obvious that you're relying on or being informed by sort of the evolution or the history of book illustration in some of the things that you're doing. But let's stick right now with the cover. What I want to get from our conversation, incidentally, is what you do, how you do it, and how come you're so good at it. So
I don't think I can answer the last two questions, but
okay. Anyway, let's just look at this cover because I think it's quite stunning. And at the very top, you've got On Tyranny written, looks like finger painting in blood. That what we wanted to get at?
Yes, I mean, blood was, I tried not to make it look too gory because I think that's boring. And so I had different variations. I had the type also in green and blue and tried out whether that worked. But then in addition to the blood association, red also is just a very alarming color. So
Yes.
for me, yes, it could look like blood, but it's also just what was more important to me was that it look alarming. Also, there are maybe associations with the Nazis' swastika emblem because the main colors I'm using are black, red, and white, but in a very uncomfortable, unpleasant, off-putting way. I mean, from a marketing perspective.
Yes.
Strange to use these questions, but these descriptions. But of course, I didn't want to refer to that emblem in a in a positive sense, obviously, but in a sense of, okay, this is a warning. This book is like an antidote to what happened before under the Nazi regime. So I drew it, I painted it with a brush, so it's not finger painted, and I worked with 10-speed press, which is, they were all wonderful. My editor and the art director and the publisher were extremely supportive in everything I did, and Timothy as well. So I really had free reign, and the cover is always the place where you have more scrutiny from a publisher, understandably, because it is what sells a book. And I want the book to sell, obviously. I want the book to be read. So I listened to that advice, and they're professionals. But again, this was the first cover I suggested, and they immediately supported it. And so I took one of the images from the book, which is a hand-folded origami skull. That is from a chapter in the book that talks about how easily we can slip from being a soldier into becoming, or a mercenary into becoming a killing machine that basically observes somebody else's orders without deeply reflecting on them. And so what I did in that chapter was I painted the face of a soldier or a paramilitary, it's not really defined which one it is, man, and step by step I fold, with each new page I fold this head into the shape of a skull. And what I wanted to symbolize by doing that was this slow creeping transformation that we're often not aware of, but that we're often part of and are often not questioning. And I wanted to bring in, I thought that by bringing in this origami effect, this very physical quality of the act of folding this could evoke a very visceral response in the reader, because we've all at least tried, I'm not very good at origami, but tried these kind of paper games. So there's a certain playfulness in it, but a playfulness that becomes really gloomy when you arrive at the last page that shows the skull. And then I added a drawn body to the skull, and looking at this image on that page, I realized this is, to me, in a way, one of the many faces of tyranny. This could be a personification of the word tyranny. And then I thought, okay, let's pull that out for the cover. And then how can I integrate the title into that? And so I lifted up the skull from the body
in terms of that, it's a bag, basically. It's an empty, it's hollow, it's empty, it's kind of stupid. That's what I see. And then I see the way that you've torn the paper away from the eye to make the holes. It almost looks like tears. And then you've got this mouth, it's like a grill of teeth, like the skull. It just says, I don't know why it says tyrant to me, but it does. It's just like a kind of an airhead, but scary as hell.
Yeah, and often, I mean, without naming names, but you know, there have been airheads in recent history that are nonetheless very dangerous in American recent history. So we have to take this seriously, and we often don't, and we find it funny and laughable, and we become very passive. And bit by bit, we're sliding into tyranny. And then for the cover, I moved up the skull from the body and pushed the word tyranny in between the skull and the body. And I had all kinds of associations. Of course, there's this idea of beheading, but there's also all the statues that you see, you know, after a leader is brought down, like Saddam Hussein at the time. There were all these photographs of his statue being taken down or beheaded, and suddenly, you know, and this book is about how can we deconstruct tyrants or tyrannical ideas. And so I played a little bit about with that idea by placing the word in between the head and the body.
Seeing this bag head floating in the air, it just had such an impact. Can you explain any of that?
I just played around with the elements in Photoshop. And, you know, I think this is what often happens. We have a lot of associations, visual associations stuck in our head that we get from popular culture, from the history of visual traditions. And I don't necessarily think of them as I design these things, but then I'm sure they flow into it in some ways. I mean, looking at it just now, I also suddenly thought of the old Japanese ghost woodblock prints that often have these elongated necks with the floating heads, and it has something ghost-like too, something that you can't quite grasp, that threatens you, but you can't catch it because it's, you know, it's volatile, and it's all of that.
And now I'm thinking of those skeletons that you see often with old printing presses, you know, so anyway, very effective. And then underneath it, you've got this kind of black, dirty, thick pencil kind of bodybuilder body with the 20 lessons from the 20th century right on its chest.
Yes. Again, I had all kinds of associations. I wanted obviously to convey this idea of aggression, and that's why I had this body belt. You know, I was thinking a lot about the SS and, you know, certain types of body types that were favored or, you know, that were attracted to certain divisions of the SS and the SA at the time in Nazi Germany. And so I drew from that also the color black, which was used in some of the Nazi SS uniforms. And there's also certain blotchiness about the way that, you know, smudges from the drawing that I...
kind of smoke or dust coming off it, charcoal.
Those are interesting associations too. I mean, smoke and war, you know, belongs together. But I was also throughout the whole book thinking a lot about the traces that history leaves, the traces that we leave by the actions that we take or decide not to take. And so it was very important for me to keep some of that physicality to indicate this idea of, you know, these are our fingerprints that are going to be staying on forever. I mean, the same with what's happening with Ukraine and in Russia, you know, whatever Russians decide to do or not to do at the moment will leave fingerprints for centuries to come. And we will have to confront those, or they will have to confront those.
You mean sort of moral questions? Is that what you mean?
Yes, moral and yeah, I mean, all kinds of traces. I mean, when you take Berlin as an example, there are the physical traces. You know, you can still see bullet holes in some of the old buildings from the Second World War.
Yeah.
But also the emotional traces are extremely deep amongst Germans. The guilt and the never-ending question of how do we face this? How do we continue to face this? Make sure it never happens again. And it's our responsibility, and we have to face up to it. And I think leaving these smudges in a way is a way of saying we have to face up to the traces that we leave by, the actions we take or don't take today.
There's also, of course, the association with the strong man, but then you have these big hands, like these big dumb hands, almost like they've got a barbell in them, but there's no barbell, and the thumbs are kind of stuck behind the fingers, and that tells me that there's some kind of anxiety. This is how I saw it. There's also two little lines, one off each hand, and I just couldn't. I'm so happy to be able to ask you about those two odd little lines that are sticking off these hands. Why is that?
I didn't want them to look too neat, I think. So I wanted, again, kind of the mistakes or the accidentalness. I wanted to retain that. I didn't want it to be too clean. I also drew them very quickly and by pushing the pencil down quite hard. I mean, I tried to feel that feeling of aggression. And what your interpretation of fear is interesting, because all I was thinking about was aggressiveness. But then again, of course, the two are connected. I mean, I think what's happening in the world these days is a reaction to fear, irrational fear too. And that often turns into aggression if you have no other ways of confronting or analyzing or engaging with your own fears. Then you just turn it into anger. And but it's true, there's an element of fear in there as well.
Fear and anxiety and tension. Yeah. Just to finish off the body, two dorky looking tiny little feet. And again, it's like, okay, it's a strong man, but it's actually a little man.
It's, this is the kind of instance where I just do things and then it's interesting to me to then think about it in retrospect. And I wasn't thinking about why the small feet. I mean, again, the boots, and the way the pants are stuck into them.
Yeah, it's kind of a buffoonish a little.
It's also very much like the Nazi uniforms. But it's, and the sound of those boots. I mean, we all have associations with that, political associations. But I guess the main focus was supposed to be the hands and the chest, where the real power is. I mean,
But as I say, I just love those little feet because, again, they tell me that this is a little person here. This is not an important big. This is a little person pretending to be a tough guy, and then they're both facing in the same direction, which again, to the side, it just looks so dorky, connected with that big body. I love it.
I mean, I also have a very strong fondness of two-dimensional flat artwork. I mean, that's what I love about the Japanese wood block prints, and that's what I love about medieval history, medieval art and Renaissance art, this kind of flatness. And
why do you love that?
I don't know. I was just thinking about that. I wonder if it's because it seems to focus on something, it seems to shift the focus on the essential message in a way. It makes it more, not educational, but it makes it more, it has a more direct, I think it has a more direct, because it's so stripped down, there's no worry about getting the light and the shadow right and the three-dimensionality and the perspective. It's just about the figures and the expression of the figures and their relationship to their immediate surrounding and to each other, but it doesn't worry about getting things right from a technical point of view. I'm also very much influenced by German Expressionism. So I think it's this immediacy that this evokes in a way that I think it can hit a more emotional core.
Kind of what, more raw or visceral, you mean?
Yes, I think there's a directness. I mean, also with religious imagery from the Middle Ages, I think the telling of the story of Jesus and the never-ending retelling of it in churches, and the basically certain element of indoctrination also that helps us understand his life and his stories and why they should have meaning for us. I do think that the flatness somehow can support that and bring it home in a different way, but it's just my personal preference.
Okay. Yeah, that brings up this sort of shamanic repetition that you reference in the book at various points. You know, there's Hillary Clinton, for example. There's this repetition of her image, and this is what we should be aware of: is that this is what tyrants do. They'll keep repeating the same damn slogan over and over again to, as you say, to try and indoctrinate their listeners and audience. Yeah, there's just moving along to well, this smudging that we've talked about. That smudging is throughout the book. There's all sorts of smudges, which is interesting.
Yes. Again, I think I wanted the whole book to have I mean, one idea was the one that I talked about earlier with the origami, is that I wanted the reader to have a sense of interactivity, you know, that I think the physicality of the smudges and some of the playfulness could draw the reader in, because it makes the book almost like an activity book.
Yes.
And I wanted to convey that idea, because I think what Timothy Snyder talks about is the danger that I mean, on the one hand, the danger that we participate often without even knowing that we are in the shift from democracy to dictatorship. But we can also actively participate in the fight against tyranny. And so the participatory aspect is what I wanted to bring in by making the book look a little bit like an activity book. And also some of the conceptual ideas. I mean, there's one drawing, an upside down drawing,
Yes.
where he talks about the transformation, or he's quoting Ionesco about the transformation of a university professor into a believer in Nazi ideology, and made a drawing of a face that can be looked at from two different perspectives. So when you hold the book in its usual position, it looks like a university professor, and then when you turn it upside down, and the last paragraph on that page is printed upside down so that you have to turn it upside down to read it, suddenly the face looks like that of a Nazi. And so again, I wanted to force the reader to participate, because you know, in a way, the book is a wake-up call, and it asks for the reader's participation. So that's why I wanted to bring the playfulness in it. And then a third aspect is I also, in all of my work, I really like this sense of visual diary and collage, and that's for a variety of reasons. One is that, to me, you know, the idea, thinking about the idea of memory and history, is a very fragmentary thing. I mean, we read about it in history books, but we often forget that history didn't happen as events, but as individually experienced moments, decisions, feelings, smells. You know, it was something that was individually experienced and suffered, and collectively too. And then we write it down, and then it becomes, you know, history. But history is now. I mean, history is every second of every day. And I'm trying to convey that by showing the fragmentary nature that we then assign a certain logic to. So it's not chaos I'm showing in the book. It's, you know, looking at one subject from different perspectives and having a sort of kaleidoscopic collage-like visual quality to convey that.
Different mediums too. In fact, I love how, I mean, I think it was Walter Benjamin that talked about the confetti of history being ephemera, and I love the fact that you've evidently snooped around. This is a big part of my life, snooping around flea markets and antique stores and such. I suppose just getting a bank of stuff that you might be able to use in your later creative moments, or what? Or were you specifically looking for stuff relating to this book?
I like that you use the term snooping around, because that's what I always call what I'm doing, because calling it detective work would be pretentious, and it's not quite research, because that can sound academic. I know it's not always academic, but it's really looking, confetti, you know, looking for the human traces of war and the ways in which it physically resonates and materializes. I mean, material culture is now a bigger discussion in academic context as well. But for me, it's actually, I'm trying to emotionally engage with these photographs and artifacts that I find at flea markets all over Europe, but mostly in Germany and mostly in Berlin.
Yeah.
And most of what I used in On Tyranny was actually from the collection I put together during my research on my other book, Belonging. And there I specifically was looking for photographs and objects that were owned by individuals under the Nazi regime.
Yeah.
So not propagandistic material. I mean,
no. Photo albums and scrapbooks.
And also objects. I mean, one object I found is an old tin metal box that a German prisoner of war made out of the scrap metal of a crashed airplane as his own tobacco box while he was imprisoned. And he decorated it with, I think a nail and a hammer on the front, on the lid, with a scene that looks kind of like a romanticized scene of the place where maybe he came from. And just to think about the fact that some German soldier carried this box in their pocket, and now I'm holding it. I mean, it's at once a very uncomfortable experience, but because it provides almost a direct link to somebody who might or might not have, I mean, you don't really know, believed in Nazi ideology. And now you are holding this object. And what does it mean to own these things? What responsibility do I have as the new owner? To preserve this very personal history. And I do think we have a responsibility. I mean, one of the reasons for why I go to these flea markets is also to preserve these things that could otherwise fall into the hands of, dubious people. I mean, at one time I went to a Turkish flea market in the Wedding area of Berlin, and I found, and it's really a market that is kind of, they have broken household goods, old lampshades. It's not a place one really can recommend to the normal tourist. But
sounds exactly like what I'd be interested in.
Yes, because when you just find things in between those, and they're often overlooked. And there was this one little book that was lying on the table and it had the word Erinnerungen, which means memories, on the spine. And I picked it up and opened it up, and it pretty quickly became clear that this was an album of a soldier from the Second World War, which is not completely uncommon. But what was uncommon was that it featured 6 photographs of an atrocity that was committed by the Nazis right at the beginning of the war when they invaded Poland. And I didn't know what the atrocity was when I looked at these photographs. There was no labeling. And I took it to various archives, both in Germany, and I took it to Der Spiegel, and I took it to the New York Times. And finally, I found out what this was. And it was an act of revenge on the part of the Nazis for the partisans were, in an effort of trying to keep the Nazis back when they invaded, were engaged in killing some of the so-called ethnic German community in Poland. Some of which was supportive of the Nazis' invasion, and for doing that they retaliated and killed partisans and Catholic priests, and these 6 photographs are evidence of that historic event. And I'm finding it at a Turkish flea market in the middle of vacuum cleaner parts, and it's just such a strange experience. And the question is, what do I now do with that? I mean, I showed it at the museum in Munich, but what responsibility do we have to preserve these and to make sure they're not being, I mean, they're collectors, right-wing collectors all over the world.
Yes. In fact, there's more collectors there, aren't there? There are more collectors on the right wing than there are on
I'm sure.
Yeah.
And that's why I try to say whatever I can, and probably, potentially in the end, use it as material for my books, but also maybe donate it to an archive at the, when I'm moving on to another subject. I mean, the book that's right across from the title page in On Tyranny is also, that was from an antique shop in West Berlin, where I got engaged in also kind of dubious conversations with the owner of that antique shop, where I didn't quite figure out what his political viewpoint is. And it was a photograph I found in just like a box full of loose photographs. It's not titled, but it shows a scared looking man with a beard and a black cap and a gray coat and a white wristband on his right arm.
Yeah.
Directly in the camera. And, I've spoken to a few historians who said that it is possible, if not likely, that this is a Jewish man, in probably Poland. And I mean, the armband would speak to that too, like an early version of what they were asked to wear. And I placed this across from the title page because I wanted to show the shadow image of tyranny. I mean, we associate with tyranny, we so often associate certain types of statues or propagandistic visual material, but I wanted to show, what's the opposite face. This is basically the opposite face of the one on the cover.
Well, again, like so much of the book, it has faces and eyes staring directly at the reader, of course, sort of almost accusing them, or at least trying to goad them into some kind of action, not just to sit here and read this, but do something. But no, the look it's such an interesting look, as you say, scared, but also like, why the hell are you photographing me? Am I going to get into even more trouble with you photographing me? It's just, speaks to the kind of lot of someone who is being persecuted.
Yes, and also I'm glad that you interpreted the recurring motif, I would call it, of people or also animals, but looking directly at the viewer. I've repeated that constantly throughout the book because I wanted this direct confrontation with the reader, because that's what Timothy does in his text. He wants us to look, and he wants us to see. Also, seeing is also about witnessing. So,
Yes.
I include, there's always the question of, are you allowed to show the victims? But I think it's not so much about are you, but about how do you do it? And I think there are many ways of doing it that's respectful and not voyeuristic. And I put this photograph of the man on the title page, across from the title page, because I think by looking at him, we're witnessing that moment. And that means that we're not forgetting the moment or him. I feel like we owe it to him to look at him. And he's looking at us. And,
he is directly,
Yeah. And so that's why I included a lot of photographs also with the in the third chapter where Timothy writes about Wendell Phillips' quote on.
Yes.
I can't quote it because I only have the Dutch.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah, that's the abolitionist who's talking about
eternal freedom, the price of it. I can't translate from the Dutch.
The abolitionist Wendell Phillips did in fact say that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And again, vigilance is a good word to describe what you've done with the illustrations, but also this is what you are encouraging the reader to do, is to be vigilant and in our observation of what's going on and calling stuff out.
Yeah, and in this instance, obviously Timothy Snyder, the focus of the book is not American history and the history of slavery, because that's not his area of research. But I took this quote from the abolitionist Wendell Phillips as an opportunity to call, again into attention that obviously slavery and colonialism were also and continue in some ways to be acts of terrorism and tyranny. So
yes, it's eternal, isn't it? It's kind of with us, and it's always with us.
Yeah, contemporary racism is a continuation of all that, and so I put a photograph from the Library of Congress that shows two formerly enslaved persons with really ragged clothes, looking directly at the camera and confronting us and confronting our, lack of action when it comes to facing up to both our colonial and history of slavery, but also contemporary fight against racism.
Yes, it is kind of almost like it's like an accusation of bad behavior.
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah, this is interesting because you chose to sort of emphasize that, where it was just in passing for Timothy, but and that gets to your role as an illustrator. I mean, basically, you were reading the text and giving your interpretation of it.
Yeah, I mean, as illustrators, you have a lot of power in that way.
You do, for sure. You're able to emphasize certain things that in the text and bring them out and focus on them.
And it's funny because in one of the interviews we did together, Timothy said that, well, he is an American, but he's a scholar of European history, and that's what his books are about. And I'm a German, and I made the book more American because of, images like that. And it's funny when that happens, but it can only happen, obviously, when you work with somebody who's really generous in their trust to what you do. And I was very lucky in that.
Well, I was going to say, Dickens he monitored what Fizz did very, very closely because it was so, obviously so important. He wanted to make sure that he had control of the way that people thought about his character and thought that they looked.
Yeah. Yeah. But, I mean, I understand that, but I mean, luckily, this was really, this was a true collaboration, meaning that I think what he wanted was the illustrations to add a different dimension. That instead of illustrating his text, bringing it into a different realm. And I mean, that's what you get with literature that's turned into movies too. I think the best movies obviously don't necessarily stick doggedly to the script, but they reinvent it. They think of it as a new form of telling the story. And you have to take certain liberties if you do that. And that's, I think, to me, the most important role of an illustrator anyway is not to translate text into images one by one, but to create this other layer that transports different emotions and sometimes can even contradict the text or ridicule it, but it's an added experience rather than a visual translation of something that's already existing.
Well, isn't it interesting? I mean, it's the kind of triangular relationship. It's there's the text, there's what you have to say about the text with the illustrations, and then there's me getting what I get out of the text and the illustrations and coming up with another conclusion. Yeah,
exactly. And it's almost like a process. I mean, books are always a snapshot of a certain moment in time. I mean, who knows how I would have illustrated this book this year? With all the new stuff that's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And so it's always just a snapshot of a particular moment in time. And it, as you say, it can be perceived differently by different people, by the readers. It can be read very differently again in a year from now. It shifts in a way. It's not, even though it's printed on paper, in a way, the experience is not as static as we might think.
You also talk about conveying empathy.
Yes, I mean, I think that's what we need in order to understand history. I think if we only think of history as facts that have no relationship to us, I think we're missing one of the most important parts. And I think that's why the personal narrative is so important. And again, I see that as my role as a writer and as an illustrator, to highlight how war affects people on an individual, everyday level. I'm working on a new project at the moment that's going to come out in book form next year that is about the war in Ukraine. And ever since the first week, I've been interviewing a Ukrainian journalist and a Russian artist about their experience, everyday experience and confrontation of the war. So I interview them every week, and then I put these very fragmentary answers I get into continuous text. And then I create an illustration for each of the two protagonists. And it's been published by the LA Times, among other papers. And what's
currently?
Yes. And then it'll come out in book form as a documentation of the first year of the war. But what's important for me in this project is not the facts, which are obviously extremely important to read about on a daily basis, but what does this all do to people every day? What does it mean to leave your husband behind who has to stay in Ukraine because no men between 18 and 60 are allowed to leave the country? What does it mean to return as a journalist to Ukraine from the country where you emigrated to, Denmark? So what does it mean to go back and forth between a war zone and this country where people are, just sitting in cafes? And how do you handle that emotionally? What does it mean to the Russian guy who just last week basically fled Russia at the last minute because he's worried about being drafted like so many others? All these questions that are deeply human that we don't often enough hear about in the news because there's just no space and time, obviously.
Yeah, well, and again, with your illustrations, you were bringing in probably the most important aspect of all of this, and that is how emotionally damaging it can be.
Yes, damaging physically and emotionally, but also, over the course of generations. I mean, that's what my book Belonging was about. How does this trauma on all sides? I mean, for Germans, it was a self-imposed trauma. I want to just emphasize that. It was something they brought on themselves, but it was nonetheless a trauma and continues to be, because how do you live with the legacy of the Nazis? And how is this communicated and transferred in all kinds of ways, not only positive, it's not just that we all do. Germans do a lot of memorializing, but the personal confrontation regarding what happened in our own families is often not done enough. And so, how do these stories and also rumors, the things we want to believe about our families or about the war, how does this shift over the course of generations, and how does it remain part of us, and what's the collective versus the individual experience and memory? And yeah, so those are the kind of questions I'm interested in general. And again, I think that illustration can really underline that personal, or can create an entry point, an emotional, visceral entry point into the personal experience of war, that I think is very important to our understanding of war and history.
Yeah, you're kind of humanizing history.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal, but humanizing in the good and the bad. I mean, humans also do terrible things, so
very much. Yeah,
I'm not leaving that out. Yeah.
Yeah. Just moving along then in terms of how you do this. Interesting. You've got this printing. You've got this handwritten. Well, I heard you talking about this font that you've done up that's got 4 different kinds of S's, just so you could make it look like it's handwritten. The whole book we're talking about, On Tyranny here, your version of it, is in this lovely handwriting, printed handwriting that makes it feel kind of intimate and personal, as you've said, and homemade.
Yes, again, it as you said, it makes it more human in a way, because it ends up looking a bit like an illustrated diary or something. It makes it more intimate.
Something precious.
But also intimate in a sense that you have to confront it from a personal level. You can't just confront it as a historian, or it's part of us. And we all have a responsibility to confront the histories of our past, and also of our families. I mean, how many people go to archives to research whether their family profited from slavery or owned slaves? Probably not that many, but that's also part of confronting history. Yeah, I mean, when I did Belonging, I hand lettered the entire American edition, which I will never do again.
Yes.
And that came out.
How are your hands anyway? Are they kind of crippled now, or
not yet?
Deformed?
Well, I have a big I don't know. This is from drawing. It is a bit deformed, actually. Yeah, and then it came out in 16 countries, and so I had to. I was never going to hand letter it in Korean or whatever. I would have made so many mistakes. And so and paying illustrators in these countries to hand letter, which sometimes cartoonists do. Hand, but there's so much text in my books that it would have been very expensive. And so I decided to have a designer develop a font. And as you said, there are 4 variations. I mean, interestingly, you use the word the letter S as an example, which is funny because when you write SS, which I wrote,
yes.
probably write in all of my books, just as an example, and both S's look exactly the same, the reader can tell that it's, and it becomes kind of stiff also. Oh, here I actually have an example of exactly that word. So the 4 variations make it look more hand-lettered and less blocky in a way. And with every foreign edition, I work with designers to do the layout. And then obviously the challenge is that in some editions, like the Dutch or the Danish, the translation is so short that it completely changes the composition of the entire page. And then I have to work out with the designer, okay, how do we redesign the text so it flows nicely around the images without it looking like half of the page is blank. So every country and every language has its own challenges, and it's a lot of work. Every foreign edition is a lot of work, but I take full ownership of it, and I tend to be a bit perfectionist about these things.
Well, and also, again, I guess this gets to, I think that Snyder approached you, but what a gift, in a way, what a gift. Obviously, it's a hell of a lot of work, but this is, I can't think of a more important message to work on at this time than this one.
Well, it is a gift because to me, the dialogue is, to me, publishing and illustrating and writing is all about communicating. I'm not somebody who draws just for the fun of it.
Well, you did when you were a little kid, didn't you? Hopefully.
Probably, yeah. But now I only draw when I have a new book project, basically.
Right.
So there has to be the idea that this will be communicated to somebody. And with these kind of subjects, it's, to me, those are such important subjects and relevant. And to have publishers in different countries, work on this. I'm just now finished the Thai edition of On Tyranny, and working on actually one of my books, Belonging, is now coming out in Russian.
That's being published outside of the country, I'm guessing.
Yes. And that there are certain parallels to draw, and we should have learned from them, and clearly we haven't. Anyway, so it's and what's always very satisfying when I'm invited to talks in different countries is that the recognition of how universal these topics are. This is not just about Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union.
No,
this is about all of us, and we all have histories that
it's human nature,
and we all have a universal responsibility. And this always comes up from the audience. I mean, when I gave a talk in Canada about belonging, the topic quickly came up of the First Nations people, and in South America, it's other dictatorial regimes, and so wherever you go, you have legacies you have to deal with, and Well,
you're going to rival George Orwell's 1984 for being the most banned book, I'm sure.
It's funny. On Tyranny was on the bestseller list on Amazon on #1 for one day. Right. And then a few weeks later, I checked again, and there was like a right-wing guy's book replaced it. And I found that so interesting. I mean, talking about the divisiveness of the country, but what's the #1 at various points, and what does that say about us?
A dictator's not going to want your book floating around, that's for sure.
Probably not.
You do a lot of pencil drawings, lots of pencil, lots of heavy pencil. Again, that's your hands doing the work.
Yeah, pencil is my favorite tool also to write. I always write in my calendar in pencil. I love the organicness of it. I like that it's not wasteful too. There's an environmental aspect to it too. But it is so organic also when you press on the paper in different ways. You get different lines, so it really responds. There's a direct connection between your hand and the paper. But I love it as a tool, and I think you can do many different things with it.
There's one image where you're actually referring to, I think it's the Stanley Milgram experiments, Yale at Yale, and it's got this woman's face that's punctured with holes from a needle or electric shocks or whatever it is. I couldn't help but think of, there's a famous cover of a Paul Rand cover where there's actual physical holes in I think it's in a face or a sculpture or something in one of his books. I'll get you the name of that, but. Yes, any particular designer, book designer, illustrator that's influenced your work that you think is the best?
Oh God, I mean, there's so many that I really can't say there's one best person. I mean, in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, I love German expressionism, partly because of the rawness of the drawings and paintings, but also because of the subject matter, because there's certain pacifist quality to it, showing the horrors of war.
Edvard Munch was an important illustrator too, wasn't he? Yeah, okay.
And then, I mean, there's so many storytellers, visual storytellers who I admire, like Chris Ware, the graphic novelist. I mean, it's stylistically very different from what I'm doing, but I just love how he dismantles our sense of time and space, which I guess I try to do in very different ways. But to me, he's really a sort of genius. But also, I really love also documentary film, because my work is also visual nonfiction. Yeah, no, I actually studied documentary film. So I've made a few documentary films, and it's something that I could have very much seen myself going into and then abandoned. But I feel like I'm trying to return to it now. I mean, a lot of the work I do now is based on interviews, on editing, on thinking about what's the textual level and what's the image level. I mean, everything that filmmakers think about. And so I really admire the work of documentary filmmakers, especially those whose work is poetic and essayistic, like Werner Herzog, the German filmmaker, but also Joshua Oppenheimer, who did The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, about the genocide in Indonesia. I don't know if it's genocide, but the killings, and really his work is so visually striking without being sentimental. I mean, I wouldn't even call it beautiful because the subject matter is so horrifying, but it's very respectful and just very striking. Yeah, I mean, there's just another documentary film I really admire called Darwin's Nightmare, about Lake Victoria in Tanzania, and just people who deal with serious subjects, but in unconventional and poetic ways. That's what I'm interested in.
That's just what I was going to mention, is that there's a real seriousness about your work, obviously.
There is. I mean, I think there's sometimes also a sense of humor. I don't know if it's read as humorous by other people, but right. I'm trying to find an example, but
well, it's not funny. It's kind of striking and shocking the way you, in a number of places, you've actually you removed the eyeballs from one of the faces and put it down on the chest. That was striking, and it stopped me.
But again, I mean, this illustration is about ignorance, so not looking, not witnessing.
No, exactly. And look how it transforms a face when you take the eyes out of the face.
Yes, and again, we talked about this kind of more naive, flat, two-dimensional depiction versus a more three-dimensional one. And in this instance, again, if I had done a photorealistic illustration of a face and had removed the eyes, it would have just seemed gory and cliched and horror. I don't know. It wouldn't have. It would have been very voyeuristic, and it would have removed the viewer from what the message is actually about. But by abstracting the face and really hand cutting out the eyes rather than really taking out the eyeballs in a more anatomical looking way, it brings it back to Snyder's message of not looking.
Yeah. You also use a lot of cutouts and paper. We did refer to that, but that's another technique of yours.
Yes, and I also thought a lot about not only creating something, but also taking something apart. And again, there was a symbolic meaning to me about that, because I think we have to dissect history. We have to think about how history is written. Sometimes it has to be rewritten. I mean, we see this now, obviously, with the history of colonialism and everything, decolonizing and so forth. And so I think the act of taking apart, and again, there's this physical connotation also of cities being destroyed and bombed. And, I try to evoke that with cutting out and leaving empty spaces behind and so forth.
Just winding down here on page 27, you have this lovely, very evocative young girl. I couldn't help but think that was a self-portrait. Maybe I'm out to lunch, but
I'm not a young girl. But
no, you're not, but you used to be, and you've got short hair like her. So I just felt, I wonder if that's her.
So this is actually, so this page talks about how Jewish life disappeared in Austria and Germany under the Nazi regime, and that often people were just standing by and not doing anything. And it shows a woman that's very translucent looking.
Yeah, she's got kind of almost like a blank stare. She's staring into the distance.
Well, it's not clear if she's already disappeared, if she's just a ghost of herself or if she's still there. And that was the idea. And what I did was I researched just photographs of Jewish people who were, persecuted. I mean, I think she survived. She was able to flee. But I used the photograph just as a base. I mean, it's not a photographic likeness, but it's not me. It's that woman, this Jewish woman who I read about and found a photo of. I used that as an inspiration and then created a drawing with pencil and then actually erased parts of the drawing again. And again, used smudges. And then at the very bottom, I drew a series of people, many of them from behind, because to me, that's also something I did a lot in my other book, Belonging, showing people from behind. Again, is this questioning this idea of, are you looking away on purpose, or what are you looking at? Or also looking at something from a distance, looking at history from a distance. And so these are actually copied from photographs I found in my hometown in Germany of people waiting for Adolf Hitler to appear at the main market square in his car.
There's scenes of that in The Triumph of the Will. That there's a lot of him going along in cars and big crowds. And
yeah. And so there's also a documentary aspect in these particular drawings of the bystanders that I added on the bottom of that page. And again, this was used throughout art history also, the putting a figure from behind somewhere in the foreground who's watching the important event on the painting as a way of drawing the viewer in and saying, oh, look, this is you. You're the one who's standing by and doing nothing. So in a way, it's a representation of the reader.
Yes. I must say, though, this drawing of this young woman is haunting. She's hauntingly beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just finally then, a couple quick questions about the photo montage. I've just been right into John Hartfield. And I'm so impressed with his courage as much as anything, but also his brilliant use of images and humor and sarcasm and whatever you want to call it, to make really important points, bringing out hypocrisy and whatever. Influence? He's an influence?
Yes, definitely. I love his work, and it's very playful and it has a sense of humor. I mean, dark humor. I very much appreciate it.
And also lots of fire. You use fire in this, but maybe you could just tell me again what, in a nutshell, what as an illustrator, what do you do?
I mean, you mean me or illustrators in general?
I mean both, yeah.
I mean, in very basic terms, what illustrators do is shed light. I mean, that's what the word says, shed light on something. Ideally, I mean, there's also visual propaganda, which does the opposite. So I do think there's ingrained in the idea of being an illustrator is this idea of exploring the depths of the human character. And by drawing what we see, we also in turn We create a mirror image of who we are as people, and then that image influences who we could become. So I feel, again, there's a fluidity, images that are created in our cultures are guidelines too for us. I mean, we see it a lot, obviously, with the history of religious imagery, but also contemporary advertising and all of the stuff. But I think that we make images that reflect who we are, but they also in turn shape and change the way we are when they're seen. I mean, when you think about the old Hieronymus Bosch paintings, it's incredible that somebody did this hundreds of years ago, and it's a comment on our society and on human behavior, and not much has changed. And I always tell that to my students. That's what's so important about being an illustrator, is to be aware of that history, but also of our responsibility, because we do shape the way that our societies think about the world.
In many, well, again, depending on how popular illustration is, you can be just as influential as the writer.
Yes. And, before people could read, there was only illustration to convey ideas, social ideas, political ideas, propagandistic ideas. Illustration was the one medium that was understood by everybody, and only the monks could read and write. And so, I mean, I'm talking about European history, obviously, but I think illustration has always had a central role, and it has even now a stronger role than many of us are aware. I mean, often when you talk to people about what you do as a profession, and you say illustration, and it's often belittled a little bit, I feel like.
Especially graphic, the graphic novels, the comics. It's, again, to use our word, they weren't and haven't been taken seriously. But now it seems that there's, or at least it's taken more seriously.
Yes, I think, Maus changed that in the 90s. And I think America is really at the forefront of recognizing the graphic novel as a serious form of literature. I mean, France is also very much thinking in it in that vein. But I think many other countries don't have that consciousness. But even when we think about picture books, picture books are crucial in shaping the most fundamental ideas in the next generation of people who will rule this world, or not rule it. And I think we have to really appreciate what children's book illustrators do. Learning about empathy can help avoid wars in the future. Thankfully, a lot of children's books do that these days, but I think it's not given enough credit.
There's a new book coming out about Maurice Sendak, the actual his practice, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So
he was wonderful, obviously.
Well, it seems to me that what you do is you think deeply about what you're going to produce. I mean, maybe that's just an obvious thing, but it seems to me that what makes you so good is that you think very seriously about what you're going to put on the page.
Well, that's what we're trying to do at the Parsons School of Design, where I teach, but is to make our students also understand that illustrators shouldn't be just interpreters, but visual thinkers. And again, the sense of responsibility plays into this too, because the medium has been abused a lot over centuries, and what and how we communicate is very, very important. So I do think we have to think about it very deeply.
Well, I judge a book by, one gauge anyway, is how much I think about it. And I've really thought a lot, and it's stimulated a lot of thought. Your really great illustrated graphic edition of On Tyranny. So thank you for providing me with, I don't think it was 20 lessons about illustration, but it was certainly informative, and I really appreciate the time you spent with me.
Thank you so much for the kind words and the interesting questions, and for the time.
Very good. So I've been speaking with Nora Krug, and maybe you could just do the extra for me. What do you, who are you now, as opposed to at the beginning of this, and where are you going?
I've never done a professional extra before, so I'll try my best. I've really realized that illustrating nonfiction visual books on politics is my thing, and I
Yeah,
want to stick with that. I mean, every book takes me a lot of thought and a lot of time, and there's only so much time in one's life. So I don't want to waste my time, and this is what I'm going to continue doing. As I mentioned before, I'm doing a book about Russia and Ukraine at the moment that's going to come out next year. And I'm also interested in many other subjects, including colonialism and contemporary racism. And so I have many subjects that are floating around that I'm embarking on research, visual and book research. And then we'll see what will come out of them.
very good. Well, it's been great to meet you this way. Thank you so much for taking the time again.
Thank you, Nigel.